Picture this. It's 1950, and two of America's most legendary generals sit across from each other in a dimly lit office. One has just been given supreme command of NATO forces. The other? He's thousands of miles away in Tokyo, governing occupied Japan like a modern-day emperor. Douglas MacArthur leans forward, his eyes burning with conviction, and tells Dwight Eisenhower something that will change everything. Ike, the war never ended. We're just fighting it differently now. What Eisenhower said in response would reveal not just a clash of military minds, but two completely different visions for America's future. One man saw the Cold War as a battle that had already begun, a conflict that demanded immediate action and unwavering commitment. The other, he wasn't so sure we should be fighting it at all, at least not in the way MacArthur envisioned. This wasn't just a conversation between two generals. It was a pivotal moment that would shape American foreign policy for the next 40 years. The decisions made in rooms like this one would determine whether millions lived or died, whether nations remained free or fell under totalitarian control, and whether humanity would survive the nuclear age. MacArthur and Eisenhower both understood the stakes. They simply couldn't agree on the solution. When Eisenhower arrived in Tokyo in 1946, he wasn't prepared for what he found. MacArthur had transformed himself into something beyond a general, beyond even the supreme commander he'd been during the Pacific War. He ruled Japan from the Dai-ichi life insurance building like a benevolent dictator, reshaping an entire nation's government, economy, and society with a stroke of his pen. Eisenhower, fresh from his triumph in Europe where he'd coordinated the largest amphibious invasion in history and accepted Nazi Germany's surrender, expected to meet the soldier he'd known before the war. Instead, he encountered a man who believed he understood Asia in ways Washington never could, never would. MacArthur had become, in his own mind and in the minds of many Japanese, a kind of American Caesar, the architect of a new democratic Japan rising from the ashes of militaristic empire. MacArthur had always been different from other American generals. Where Eisenhower was political, pragmatic, and team-oriented, someone who could work a room and build consensus among difficult personalities, MacArthur was theatrical, absolute, and solitary. He made decisions alone, announced them with dramatic flair, and expected complete obedience. He rarely consulted subordinates and almost never admitted mistakes. Their relationship stretched back decades, filled with mutual respect tinged with fundamental disagreements about leadership and strategy. They'd both risen through the ranks of an army that was, for most of the interwar period, tiny and underfunded. They'd both studied at West Point, though MacArthur's record there was legendary while Eisenhower's was merely solid. They'd both served under demanding commanders and learned hard lessons about military leadership, but their paths had diverged dramatically during World War II. Eisenhower became the face of Allied unity, the general who could somehow get British, American, French, and Canadian forces to work together, despite centuries of rivalry and mutual suspicion. MacArthur became the lone wolf of the Pacific, the general who operated with minimal interference from Washington, who conducted island-hopping campaigns with theatrical brilliance, and who accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri with the presence of a conquering emperor. Now, as the world's power structure shifted from defeating fascism to containing communism, these two titans of American military history found themselves on diverging paths once again. MacArthur had witnessed the communist threat firsthand. He'd seen Soviet influence spreading through China like a virus, watched Mao Zedong's forces gain ground against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, despite massive American aid, and observed communist movements gaining strength throughout Southeast Asia. To him, the pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. Eisenhower, meanwhile, was being groomed for something different. He understood global politics in ways MacArthur never would. He'd worked directly with Churchill, negotiated with Stalin at Potsdam, and navigated the treacherous waters of alliance politics with de Gaulle. He knew that the next war, if there was one, wouldn't be won on battlefields alone, but in the complex chess game of international diplomacy, nuclear deterrence, and economic competition. The stage was set for a confrontation between two fundamentally different views of America's role in the world. MacArthur's warning to Eisenhower wasn't a casual observation shared over drinks. It was a calculated alarm based on intelligence that deeply troubled him, intelligence that flowed into his Tokyo headquarters from dozens of sources across the Pacific. By 1950, MacArthur had built an extensive network of information gatherers across Asia, from former Japanese military officers to Korean nationalists to Chinese refugees fleeing Mao's revolution. What he saw in those intelligence reports convinced him that Stalin and Mao had already begun a coordinated campaign to dominate the Pacific. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The Soviets had occupied North Korea and installed a communist puppet government. They'd armed and trained Kim Il-sung's forces. They'd provided crucial support to Mao's communists in China, turning the tide against the nationalists. And now, MacArthur's intelligence suggested, they were preparing for the next move. The Korean peninsula was the powder keg, and MacArthur knew it would explode. The only question was when and whether America would be ready. When they spoke, whether in person or through the secure communications networks that connected Tokyo to Washington, MacArthur laid out his thesis with characteristic conviction. The Soviets weren't interested in peaceful coexistence. That was a fantasy harbored by naive diplomats who didn't understand the communist mind. They were orchestrating a global revolution, using proxies and puppet states to extend their reach while maintaining plausible deniability. China's fall to communism wasn't an isolated event, but part of a coordinated strategy that had been years in the making. Korea would be next, MacArthur warned. Then possibly Japan itself, despite all his efforts to democratize and rebuild it. The Philippines might follow. Perhaps even Australia and New Zealand would find themselves threatened. Once the dominoes started falling, MacArthur believed, they wouldn't stop until American power stood in their way. Eisenhower listened carefully, his poker face revealing nothing. He'd learned during the war that MacArthur's brilliance came with significant blind spots. MacArthur saw military solutions to political problems. He believed American power, properly applied with overwhelming force and unwavering commitment, could reshape Asia and democracy's image just as it had reshaped Japan. But Eisenhower had a different concern, one that kept him awake at night. Could America afford another total war so soon after the last one? The United States had demobilized rapidly after 1945. Millions of soldiers had returned home, eager to resume civilian lives. Defense budgets had been slashed. The American people were tired of war, tired of sacrifice, tired of seeing their sons come home in coffins or not come home at all. MacArthur pressed his case with the intensity of a man who believed he alone could see the approaching storm. We needed to draw a line in Asia, he insisted. We needed to show strength, commit whatever resources were necessary, and prepare for a long struggle. Hesitation would be interpreted as weakness by our enemies. Weakness would invite aggression, and aggression, if not met with overwhelming force, would lead to a war we'd have to fight on far worse terms later. Every day we delayed, MacArthur argued, was a day the communists grew stronger. Every compromise was a surrender. Every negotiation was a sign of decline. Eisenhower's response was measured but firm. He agreed the Soviet threat was real and potentially existential. But he questioned whether military confrontation was inevitable or wise, whether America had the resources and will for another global conflict, and whether MacArthur's approach might actually make war more likely rather than less. What emerged from their conversations was something more profound than a disagreement about tactics or strategy. It was a fundamental split in how America should engage with the post-war world, a division that would echo through American politics for generations. MacArthur represented the warrior tradition, a philosophy of war that stretched back to ancient times. Be direct, be forceful, and be unwilling to accept anything less than total victory. He'd spent his entire career, from his days as a young officer in the Philippines to his command of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, believing that wars should be fought to be won, not managed or contained. The idea of limited war was anathema to MacArthur. It violated everything he'd learned about military conflict. You either committed fully with all the resources and determination necessary to achieve complete victory, or you didn't fight at all. Half measures led to half victories, which were really just delayed defeats. Sending American boys to fight and die without giving them everything they needed to win decisively was, in MacArthur's view, both immoral and impractical. To MacArthur, the Cold War wasn't cold at all. It was a hot war fought through proxies, and America needed to treat it as such. Every communist advance from Berlin to Beijing was a defeat for freedom. Every accommodation, every compromise, every attempt at diplomatic solution was a surrender of American principles and American interests. Eisenhower represented something newer and more complex, a strategic philosophy shaped by the realities of the nuclear age. He understood the military-industrial complex that was emerging, though he would later warn against its dangers. He grasped the careful balance of deterrence and diplomacy, the understanding that nuclear weapons had changed warfare forever in ways previous generations couldn't have imagined. Total war was no longer an option when both sides had the capability to destroy civilization itself within hours. The United States and Soviet Union were developing arsenals that could kill hundreds of millions of people and render vast territories uninhabitable for generations. In this new reality, Eisenhower believed, traditional military thinking was not just obsolete, but potentially suicidal. Eisenhower believed in strength, in maintaining powerful military forces and demonstrating American resolve. But he saw that strength used primarily as leverage for negotiation and deterrence, not conquest. The goal wasn't to destroy the Soviet Union through military force, but to contain its expansion while building a Western alliance strong enough to outlast communism's internal contradictions. These weren't just philosophical differences debated in war colleges and think tanks. They had immediate, practical implications that would determine whether millions lived or died. When North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, MacArthur got his war. He was appointed commander of United Nations forces and executed one of the most brilliant military operations in American history, the amphibious landing at Inchon. Against incredible odds and over the objections of nearly every other military planner, MacArthur's gamble succeeded spectacularly. UN forces pushed north toward the Chinese border, seemingly on the verge of reunifying Korea under a democratic government. Eisenhower watched with growing concern as MacArthur's aggressive strategy risked bringing China and possibly the Soviet Union directly into the conflict. MacArthur dismissed these concerns, believing that Chinese intervention was unlikely and that even if it occurred, American firepower could handle it. He believed he could win decisively, that total victory was within reach if only Washington would give him the tools he needed. Eisenhower feared MacArthur was risking World War III, a conflict that could escalate to nuclear exchanges and the deaths of tens of millions. The stakes were too high for the kind of all-or-nothing approach MacArthur favored. MacArthur's warning proved both right and wrong in ways that would haunt American foreign policy for decades. He was absolutely correct that the Cold War had begun in earnest, and that Korea would become a hot battlefield. He was right that communist forces would test American resolve repeatedly across multiple continents. He correctly predicted that weakness or hesitation would invite aggression, but he was catastrophically wrong about the solution. His push toward the Yalu River, the boundary between North Korea and China, brought hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops into Korea in what would become one of the most massive military interventions in modern history. The Chinese assault in late 1950 caught UN forces off guard and turned what might have been a quick victory into a grinding stalemate that would last 3 more years. Eisenhower's concerns proved tragically justified. The war that MacArthur thought he could win decisively became a bloody stalemate that killed millions of Koreans, tens of thousands of Americans, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese. The front line eventually stabilized near the 38th parallel, roughly where it had started, making the entire northward advance and subsequent retreat seem pointless. When President Truman finally relieved MacArthur of command in April 1951, it wasn't because MacArthur had been wrong about the communist threat. Everyone in Washington agreed the threat was real and serious. It was because his solution, expanding the war into China and possibly using nuclear weapons against Chinese cities and military installations, risked a catastrophe that even victory couldn't justify. MacArthur had proposed bombing Chinese supply bases in Manchuria, blockading the Chinese coast, and possibly using nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan to open a second front. Some reports suggested he'd even requested authorization to use atomic bombs. The costs of such escalation would have been unimaginable, potentially drawing the Soviet Union into direct conflict and triggering the very World War III that everyone feared. MacArthur's relief sparked a constitutional crisis and a national debate about civilian control of the military. He returned home to a hero's welcome, addressing a joint session of Congress with his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech. Millions of Americans believed he'd been treated unfairly, sacrificed by politicians who didn't have the courage to pursue victory. When Eisenhower became president in 1953, he inherited MacArthur's war. But he ended it not MacArthur's way, not with the total victory and unconditional surrender that MacArthur had sought, but with an armistice that accepted division. Korea would remain split along the 38th parallel, a frozen conflict that persists to this day, one of the last remaining artifacts of the Cold War. It wasn't the outcome MacArthur wanted. He considered it a betrayal of American principles and American soldiers who died fighting for reunification. But it was the one Eisenhower believed America could sustain without risking nuclear war or bleeding the country dry in an endless Asian land war. MacArthur spent his final years convinced history would vindicate him. He gave speeches, wrote memoirs, and counseled presidents who sought his advice. He believed Eisenhower and later leaders had chosen caution over courage, management over victory, and containment over liberation. He died in 1964, still believing that America had lost its will to win. Eisenhower, meanwhile, built a Cold War strategy around the very principles MacArthur rejected: deterrence through nuclear weapons, but restraint in their use; containment of communism rather than its forcible overthrow; limited engagement in regional conflicts; and the patient belief that Soviet communism would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. The Eisenhower Doctrine, massive retaliation, the policy of brinkmanship, all reflected lessons learned from MacArthur's Korean experience. America would maintain overwhelming military superiority, but use it primarily as a deterrent. America would support allies but avoid the kind of open-ended commitments that could drain national resources and will. Looking back through the lens of history, both men were products of their experiences, shaped by the wars they'd fought and the victories they'd won. MacArthur had won total wars against defined enemies. He'd accepted the surrender of Japan and rebuilt it so completely in democracy's image that it became one of America's closest allies and a prosperous, peaceful nation. Why shouldn't the same approach work against communism? Why shouldn't American power, properly applied, reshape Asia and eventually the entire world? Eisenhower had seen war's costs on a scale few Americans could imagine. He'd walked through liberated concentration camps. He'd sent thousands of men to their deaths in operations he knew were necessary but terrible. He understood that the nuclear age required restraint even from victors, that some conflicts couldn't be won militarily without losing everything worth defending. Their conversation in 1950, and the philosophical divide it represented, echoed through decades of American foreign policy. Every president since has faced the same fundamental tension. When do we engage forcefully, and when do we exercise restraint? When is a threat so serious it demands direct military confrontation regardless of cost? And when is confrontation more dangerous than the threat itself? MacArthur's spirit lived on in those who advocated for decisive military action in Vietnam, believing we could win if only we committed fully. It influenced those who pushed for regime change in Iraq, confident that American power could reshape the Middle East. It inspired those who saw Afghanistan as a war we could win through superior force and determination. Eisenhower's caution influenced those who questioned whether every conflict required American intervention, who worried about overextension and the limits of military power, who believed that some problems couldn't be solved at gunpoint no matter how powerful the gun. The Cold War ended not with the military showdown MacArthur predicted and perhaps desired, but through the patient strategy Eisenhower pioneered. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 without firing a shot at American forces, bankrupted by an arms race it couldn't afford, and undermined by internal contradictions its system couldn't resolve. Perhaps both men were right in their own ways. MacArthur correctly identified the threat, understood its seriousness, and recognized that wishful thinking wouldn't make it disappear. His warning in 1950 was prescient. The Cold War was indeed a real war with real stakes, and pretending otherwise would have been disastrous. Eisenhower correctly identified how to defeat it, not through the climactic military confrontation MacArthur envisioned, but through sustained economic competition, alliance building, technological innovation, and the patient confidence that freedom would ultimately prove more attractive and sustainable than tyranny. The conversation between these two giants shaped America's approach to global leadership for generations. It established the frameworks we still use to debate foreign policy: intervention versus restraint, idealism versus realism, military power versus diplomatic engagement. If you found this exploration of military leadership and Cold War strategy fascinating, subscribe to dive deeper into MacArthur's extraordinary life and the other legendary generals who shaped our world. Their decisions, their conflicts, and their legacies continue to influence how America engages with the world today.